She had booked the visit between shifts at the bookstore because the free schedule demanded it, free as a thing that cost you something you couldn't quantify. His name was Daniel. The receptionist said it like a fact, uninflected. He was not the one to call numbers, he was called. When the nurse called Sophie instead, the name sounded like a small relief. She followed the nurse into a narrow corridor that smelled sharper than the waiting area, a mix of bleach and something clinical that flattened the edges of the world. The exam room was bright, an ordinary box softened by a single photograph of a shoreline. Sophie sat on the edge of the exam table with the paper crinkling under her. Her legs swung once, twice. The clipboard in her lap kept the only anchor she had. She told herself to breathe slowly as the nurse set about the trivial things, questions asked in the neutral register of procedure. She recited answers like a small litany. Her voice trembled once when she said she'd been dizzy for weeks, and the nurse wrote without comment, then left with a small smile. When Daniel entered, he moved like the rest of the world had been set to a lower volume. He apologized for the delay and said, plainly, "Sophie Harris?" And she answered because he had asked, and that was the simplest way to keep the moment from stretching. He spoke with a cadence that made medical words feel less like a foreign language. Direct, uncluttered, patient. He listened. He tilted his head in a way that told her she was the only person he had room for in that instant. He asked gentle questions, Sophie told herself later, when she tried to name what had unsettled her. He didn't hover. He gave me space to say things out loud. When he examined her, it was quick and professional. Measurements, a blood pressure cuff that tightened, a hand that pressed on an area near her ribs with the light, efficient pressure of someone who had been taught thousands of touch points and how to make them neutral. There was nothing invasive about it, nothing that felt like theft. Still, under the fluorescent light, her body felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the paper gown. Her pulse beat in her ears so loud she could feel it in her molars. "You're a good patient," he said offhandedly, and she would later think that was the kindest, honest thing anyone had told her in a long time. Not because she needed to be praised for compliance, but because his words were small enough to be true. He prescribed rest and a few tests, a blood panel, a note to avoid stressful shifts if possible. His handwriting was neat on the script he slid across. He told her to come back if anything changed, and, in that same calm, told her not to be hard on herself if she had to cancel shifts. The very idea of canceling filled her with a guilty flutter. She relied on the pay. He looked like he expected her to be practical about it, and she wanted to be. When she left the room, she felt lighter, as though the appointment had sanctioned an otherwise unnameable fear. In the corridor, the world reassembled itself. The hum of fluorescent lights, a distant monitor beep. She tucked her script into her tote and tried to fold the experience into something she could carry. He stood at the doorway as if the hallway had conspired to slow him down. For a beat, she almost thought he would say nothing else. Then he called her name and asked, quietly, if she was sure she would be all right to get home. Sophie had always been a person who answered practical questions with practical solutions. "I'll manage," she said, the phrase a shield. She did not know whether the shield was for him or for herself. He stayed where he was. "If you'd like," he said, "there's a nurse I trust who can do follow-ups. I can have her call you. You shouldn't feel you have to come right back to my practice just for routine checks." It was a small professional accommodation, and it landed oddly. One doorway opened to another with the clean language of policy. "You don't have to," Sophie started. Her voice went thin. He gave a small, almost rueful smile. "I have rules," he said. "I don't pursue patients." It was not a confessional or a tease. It was a statement of fact. "It's important. Boundaries matter. But I can make sure you get the care you need without me being your contact. If you prefer, I'll refer you." She looked at him. at the earnest angle of his jaw, at the way his eyebrows knit in the tiny crease that formed when he thought, and something in her wanted to ask more, wanted to string the moment into a necklace and keep it around her throat. Instead, she nodded. A referral would be good, she said. She felt like she had made the adult choice, the sensible one. That's what I'll do, he said. He hesitated, then, without any fanfare, reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small white card. If you need anything in the meantime, the clinic number is on here. But I mean it when I say I'll have someone else follow you up. Professional boundaries. She saw the name printed in neat type. Dr. Daniel Hammond, M.D. There was a clinic logo, contact numbers, and address. His handwriting, an elegant scrawl, had scrawled on the back, "Take care, dot." She pinched the card between her fingers as if it were a stray leaf. It was all very ordinary, and yet she left the clinic with the card like a relic. Outside, the city was bright and indifferent. Sophie walked the short block to the bus stop, the card inside her pocket like a secret. She had almost reached the curb when she felt the weight of someone beside her. Without looking, she knew it was him. "I told you I'd refer you," he said, and the sound of his voice removed any possibility of pretending the world was only the things she had told herself, that she was small, that she should be satisfied with practical gestures. He had followed. She could have felt alarmed, a warning that slithered up her spine. But the way he stood gave her a different narrative. Not a man who had come to claim, but a man who had, without asking, ensured she did not walk alone to the bus stop after a clinic visit. He kept the distance people put between themselves and strangers. He did not close it. "I didn't mean to overstep," he said. "I walked you only to make sure you didn't faint on the pavement. The clinic can be a maze." "It's fine," Sophie said, because it was, and because it also was not. Her throat tightened, and she blurted, "Thank you." He nodded once. "You're welcome." For days after, she kept the card under a stack of invoices behind the register at work, and the city took up its usual business without stopping to notice the small electric charge between two people who had exchanged no promises and only a professional scrawl. She thought of him sometimes when the dusk settled over the bookstore's front windows, when the smell of old paper and coffee made the edges of the evening soft. The card felt like a knot in her pocket. It happened again by chance, or perhaps by the sort of small gravitational pull that gathers two orbits into a collision course. A late afternoon when she ducked into the cafe across the street to escape a sudden rain. The bell above the door chimed. She moved toward the back where a high table offered better light for counting the day's receipts. The barista had a friendly face. He knew her name from the way she ordered and sometimes slid a coffee across with a smile that felt like currency. She had her head down, balancing her ledger on one knee, when she felt the room change because someone had taken the table opposite hers. Daniel looked like a man who belonged in magazines when he sat with the ease of a person who was used to being watched and was not bothered by it. He looked different outside the clinic, softer somehow, as if the uniform of authority had been replaced by the quiet of a man who read more than he prescribed. He met her eyes and did not look away. There was no dramatics. He lifted a hand in a small wave. Sophie felt the old reflex of shrinking, but there was also a seat between them and the invisibility of the ledger, and she held her ground. "I didn't expect to see you," she said, the sentence as much a question as any greeting. "I was heading to a meeting and saw the rain," he said. "I come here sometimes. I like the way the light falls in." His voice had the same even cadence as before. It was a harmless sentence, but it landed on her like rain on a hot day. They talked in the small ways that strangers do when they test whether the other is receptive to expansion. Book recommendations, the best pastry in the cafe, the fruit seller 2 blocks over who always gave you an extra orange if you smiled. Conversation loosened the wire of Sophie's chest a fraction. She told herself she would not let it go further than shared pages and small courtesies. He listened when she spoke about the bookstore, asked a question about an obscure poet she loved as if he had actually read him, and did not condescend. It was easiest to be with people who asked questions, because their curious eyes felt like permission. Outside, the rain thinned, and a small crowd gathered to wait for the light. He stood to leave and, with a manner that now felt dangerously casual, said, "I'm glad we ran into you." She watched him go and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the rain. It was a slow thing, like heat traveling through water. For reasons she didn't have language for, she stacked the card against the ledger and eventually slipped it into the change drawer in case she ever needed a reminder the world made space for her. From then on, their encounters threaded through ordinary days as if someone had rerouted the city's itinerary. Sometimes he was the voice she heard at the clinic when she called with a question and was transferred to another nurse. Sometimes he was the hand that slid a carefully wrapped copy of an old novel across the desk with a note, "For the night shifts." He appeared at the bookstore's author night once, standing at the back as if he had arrived to give his attention rather than to be seen. The pattern was the same: respectful distance, a careful presence. When he invited her, tentatively, to attend a medical charity talk he was hosting, Sophie declined. She was not ready for being conspicuous, and besides, his world felt like another continent. He learned her small rhythms, that she favored the tea over coffee when the nights were long, that she preferred second-hand editions stained at the margins, because they felt like living things, that she cut coupons with neat fingers and kept her receipts folded to look like origami. He also, later, mentioned to a colleague how she laughed when embarrassed, a small, sharp sound that made him want to see the world rearranged into something gentler. Daniel's friends would have said he kept certain things close because he cherished them. Other people read it as a sign of caution. There were gaps, too. Sophie missed an appointment once because the night shift had required her presence, and her stomach had been a tight, anxious thing. She texted the clinic from a bus stop and then put her phone away because she did not want to dwell on anything for long. He called the next day and left a voicemail, straightforward, checking in, refusing to let the message be anything other than practical. She listened to it twice and felt oddly warmed. It was a simple, professional voice, but there was something in how he said her name that sounded like someone who remembered the exact place where she left a sentence. Rumors, small, harmless ones, always float up in a city. That he had a private practice uptown, that he invested in clinics and charities with a neat mind for systems, that he had once been the subject of a profile in a glossy magazine where he had spoken about the importance of patient autonomy. Sophie let the rumors be background noise. She was not interested in lowland gossip. She had enough habitual concerns without trying to map the contours of his life. When they reached the awkward territory where acquaintance begins to feel like choice, Sophie felt the old urges flare, to shrink, to chalk the warmth up to imagination. She had been hurt before, by someone who promised a thing he could not keep and used charm as a currency. She thought, with embarrassed clarity, that wealth was a language she did not speak. The gap between her and him felt like a canyon of unspoken assumptions, a comfortable life against a life that had to count coins. She imagined herself as a character in someone else's drama, rewarded for resilience, waiting to be chosen, and each fantasy made her feel smaller. Daniel, too, carried his own carefully tended scars. In the privacy of his apartment afterward, he tasted the residue of disappointment like metal on the tongue. Once, he had trusted someone enough to make his heart an occupational hazard, and that trust had been used back against him for reasons that had to do with ego and public image. He had watched the person leave with a kind of calm he could not understand, and had spent months rebuilding a skepticism that felt safer than hope. He worked as though to prove tenderness could be practiced without ruin. When he noticed Sophie, really noticed her. He felt something like the pull he had avoided for years. It surprised him, then humbled him. It made him promise not to act in ways that would compromise the professional life that allowed him to do good. He had rules. He kept them like armor. No patience, he had once told a colleague over coffee, the sentence light, but the line drawn hard. It was not that he could not feel, it was that he had learned to protect the hinge between desire and duty. When Sophie fainted, the world rearranged into urgent, clean motion. It was a Friday evening. The bookstore was quieter than usual. The rain had stopped and left a smell of wet asphalt and the caramel warmth of the city streets. Sophie had been stacking a new delivery when the room tipped. She remembered thinking she would not fall, that she had done the math before. Drink water, rest, sit down. Then the ledger slid from her hands and the ceiling moved like a slow boat. And there was the white flash of overhead light. She registered only a split-second sensation. The counter beneath her palms, the cottony hush of fabric, a voice merciful and succinct calling her name. She came to in the back office with the manager crouched beside her, eyebrows knit in worry. The manager, Harper, was practical and not given to dramatics. "All right, Soph?" Harper asked, hands already setting a glass of water to Sophie's lips. Sophie's mouth tasted metallic. The world had the edge of a bell. Her vision took its sweet time aligning, like someone adjusting the focus on a lens. "I think I fainted," she said, and there was a small, mortified humor to the realization. She loved the bookstore and hated that her body had chosen a scene that would require sympathy. Someone pulled a phone, and before she could compute the consequences, Daniel was in the doorway. He had been at a meeting 2 streets away and had walked past on a whim. Perhaps chance, perhaps something more like a geometry of intentions, had him in the right place. He kept his distance, his hands empty, not imposing. Sophie saw him breathe and felt simultaneously grateful and exposed. "Call an ambulance," he said, the sentence calm and decisive. The manager already had the number in hand. Sophie felt the world narrow to white, practical needs: water, a check of pulse, a blanket. The paramedics' arrival was quick, professional. They moved with the economy of people trained to be useful. One of them placed a hand cool against the back of her neck to check for fever. Another gripped her wrist and measured a pulse. She felt the adhesive twinge of a BP cuff and the soft urgency in the paramedic's voice that asked about medications, allergies, the usual litany of the suddenly important. Daniel stood just outside the circle where the paramedics worked. He did not take charge of something that was not his, but he watched and made small exchanges: a note about her recent clinic visit, a brief description of symptoms he had been privy to. When the paramedics said they would transport her to the hospital for observation, Daniel offered to ride along and then recoiled almost before Sophie could answer. "You shouldn't," he said to himself more than to her. "I can't be in the ambulance." They were both saying the same rule at the same time, the professional boundary. The thought of being next to someone in an enclosed space, assumptions traded in the tilt of a shoulder. He had set a line. But something in him had bent. He was already reaching for the edge of his rule when Harper put a hand on his arm and said simply, "She needs someone who knows the situation. Could you?" Daniel had to think fast. Ethics and impulse warred in the tight space of his chest. He yielded not to desire, but to the weight of responsibility. "I'll come to the hospital," he said, "but I'll make sure a colleague handles the admission. I won't be her treating physician tonight." Sophie heard this exchange as the ambulance door thudded closed. It felt like a clause in a contract, an official map to avoid impropriety. She was surprised at the small relief that accompanied it. She did not want tangled edges. She wanted a clean place to mend. At the hospital, faces in green moved around them. The fluorescent lights hummed with the lullaby of machines that were nothing like the monitor beeps in her memory. She was wheeled into an assessment bay and given saline, a set of tests that ticked like a private clock. Her hands felt steady against the thin sheet. She struggled to reconcile the intimacy of needing help with the strangerliness of being observed. Daniel stood in the corner, hands in his coat pockets, like someone rehearsing how to keep a distance. He stayed long enough to ensure the triage nurse had all the notes, and then, when she voiced that she was assigning a different physician for overnight observation and test follow-ups, he breathed as if relief had a physical shape. "I'll be back in the morning," he said, voice low. "I'll check on her to see how she's doing, but I won't be her doctor while she's admitted." Sophie watched him leave the bay and felt the cool wash of gratitude. The boundary he maintained did not make him stranger, it made him more trustworthy. Later, when she tried to name what moved under her breast, something like the beginning of hope, she thought of the card in the drawer behind the register, the way he had followed her to the curb, the small kindnesses that were never loud. Her tests returned the next day with a verdict that felt both anticlimactic and tender. Dehydration, exacerbated by stress and missed meals. No dramatic condition, nothing that would make the evening news. She was allowed to go home with instructions to rest, to eat more regularly, to follow up with the nurse. The doctor on the ward, an efficient woman with a bun and shoes that betrayed long hours, handed her a small folder and a referral to outpatient services that could help with stress management. When Sophie sat up in the hospital chair and her hands no longer trembled with the urgency of immediate crisis, Daniel came back in. He kept his distance by design. He had not been her treating physician, and he said it aloud again like an oath. "I stuck to the rule," he said, not in a brag, but as a fact. "I had someone else sign off on the admission." Sophie saw the tightness that had settled in his jaw and knew there was a story of restraint behind it. He looked as if he'd slept on a decision and woken to the same one. He was honest in a way that did not demand reciprocation. "You can't know how relieved I was," he added, softer. "I didn't want to be the one who compromised your care." The line between them had been acknowledged and kept, and that very consideration set the tone for what might come. It was not false. For both of them, the truth of the situation had an economy that felt respectful. Sophie nodded. "I know, thank you," she said, "for being there and for choosing to do it the right way." Over the following weeks, their lives braided into a kind of slow proximity. He sent a text asking how she was advancing on meals. She replied with an emoji and a revengefully polite note about porridge. He dropped by the bookstore once with an extra pair of gloves and a book he thought she might like, an old novel with a soft cloth cover. At other times they were content to be strangers who could meet without fireworks, a mutual nod across a queue, a shared joke about the eccentricity of local authors. The economy of his patience was a landscape that made room for her decisions, and she used it like someone learning to walk across a bridge that did not tremble underfoot. She canceled shifts when she needed to, and the managers covered her with the casual grace of people who had learned to be community-minded. She went to the nurse-led clinic for follow-ups and updated the forms. Each time she checked in with the nurse on duty, she felt as though the coil of obligation loosened a notch. Daniel stayed in the periphery, steady as punctuation. When they finally admitted, to one another, and in words that were small and essential, what they felt, there was no drama. It was a conversation that began in a cafe where the light sank soft into the window frame and lingered like a witness. They both said what they had been rehearsing in private corners. He spoke of the rule he had once vowed never to break and how he had bent it in the least compromising way he knew, by ensuring he would never be her treating physician. She spoke of how hard it had been to trust a person who moved easily in a world she had always felt outside. "There's a difference between the world you live in and the way you make someone feel safe in it," he said quietly, stirring his coffee. "I want you to know I'll protect that safety." "And the other, your past?" she asked, the question jagged and necessary. "You said betrayal once. Does that mean you're afraid to be honest? Afraid to risk being hurt again? He watched the pattern of condensation on his cup for a long moment. "I'm careful," he admitted. "But I'm learning that careful is not the same as closed. With you, I find myself willing to be more open. That's the honest version." She felt her pulse in her throat as though the world were suddenly a more dangerous place by virtue of its possibility. She was afraid she would break something if she admitted she felt the same. In the soft space between them, she laid a hand on the tabletop as if the contact would be a promise. "I'm afraid I'll be disappointing," she said. "That when someone sees me, they'll see what I think of as small." He reached out then, across the table, just enough to close the tiny distance their words had not bridged. His fingers brushed the back of her hand. It was a careful touch, respectful of everything they had both been through. "You are not small," he said. "You are a person who has learned to make do. That's not a deficiency. It's strength." The months that followed were the quieter kind of courtship. Coffee shared on a bench, an evening at the bookstore where he read aloud from passages he thought she would like, long conversations about literature and the small tragedies of adulthood. His wealth, when it surfaced, didn't arrive as a trophy. It arrived as an answer to practical questions. He paid for her physical therapy when she needed it, not as patronage, but as help from someone who had the means and the inclination to make things easier. He refused to speak of charity as an act that placed him above. Instead, he preferred words that made their actions a joint economy of care. Once, pressed by an acquaintance at a fundraiser who asked about his type, he admitted with the barest smile that his type was someone who reads the dust on paperbacks and knows the names of the minor poets. The acquaintance laughed at the quaintness of the idea, but Sophie, who had overheard, felt a curious warmth. He had chosen her because she was the person he wanted to spend quiet hours with, not because she was a puzzle to be displayed. In all the small ways that mattered, Sophie was given a voice to make choices. When questions of logistics came up, where to have dinner, what weekend to visit a friend, he deferred and he negotiated. He asked permission before gifts, and when he stepped into her apartment for the first time, it was with an apology for bringing rain on his coat. "I hope it's okay if I take my shoes off," he laughed, and she welcomed him as if he were a long-expected guest. There were anxious nights. Sophie found herself awake sometimes, hands curled under the covers, thinking of the past hurt that had taught her to telescope away from the future. She feared being admired for resilience rather than for herself. She feared dependency, the shame that had been taught to girls like her as a silent curriculum, that asking for help made you a cost. Daniel, in the smaller hours, wondered whether his cautiousness would be read as distance. They had arguments that were ordinary, about time, about how to handle publicity when a mutual acquaintance mentioned him in a social column. Those arguments were the test that proved they could disagree and return. The problem of power never disappeared. They kept returning to it with a kind of mutual dedication, like two carpenters sandpapering a beam until it fit. They spoke directly of the danger of relationships that start with a difference in status and then transform into a dynamic that eroded the weaker party's agency. "I won't make your decisions for you," he said on a night when the subject rose like surf. "If you ever feel like I'm doing that, tell me. I want your autonomy to be the first rule." "And you?" she asked. "If you ever feel like I'm asking for something I can't give? If you feel I'm moving too slow?" "I'll tell you," he said, "and we'll figure it out." He believed both things with the stubbornness of someone who had learned to trust experience without letting it harden him. The crisis that would become the turning point happened in the middle of an ordinary weekend, the kind made of errands and small pleasures. Sophie had agreed to meet Daniel at the bookstore on Saturday morning for a quiet breakfast before he went to speak at a conference. She arrived early to set out coffee for a small event and, in the middle of arranging the croissants, felt the world lose the edges and then go black. This time it was more than fainting. She woke to the urgent smell of disinfectant and the clinical beeps that had become part of her life's lexicon. The hospital's emergency intake had a familiarity now, and she felt, with the low contractions of panic, that she was in a narrative she had not chosen. Daniel was there before she opened her eyes. He had been at the conference and had cut his time short the moment he received the call. He would later describe the ride to the hospital as a blur of lights and calculation. Sophie remembered the way his voice steadied at the bedside. "You scared me," he said when she blinked and focused on the ceiling tiles. His hand found hers with a movement that was quick, then steady. It was a tactile sentence, an honest one. "I'm sorry," she croaked. The apology tasted like ash. "It's not your fault," he said. He said it slowly, as though teaching a truth. "You're not alone." There was a room in his sentence that welcomed her in. The diagnosis that time was more serious, an arrhythmia complicated by dehydration and a propensity toward fainting when certain triggers compounded. The doctors had a program of monitoring and a careful plan that included cardiology follow-up and a regimen of lifestyle adjustments. He was not her treating physician. He made sure of that again, despite the ache in his fingers at wanting to be the one to map the course for her. She disliked the vulnerability of being confined to a hospital bed with him in the room. It made the world into an elemental thing. The beeping of monitors, the soft authority of white coats, the way light fell through blinds. He sat nearby, quiet, his presence a steady barometer in a sea of uncertainty. "I need to tell you something," she said one evening when the shadows lengthened and the ward grew quieter. The confession felt like a small stone she had been carrying. He tilted his head. "Tell me." "I'm scared that if you stay, it's only because you feel responsible," she said. Words tumbled out in a rush. "That you see me as someone who needs help, and that's why you're here. I'm afraid of being loved for that." He took her hand and turned it as if examining a fragile object. "I know why you'd think that. I've made choices before that were tangled with public image and duty. That's not how this is with you. I'm not here because of responsibility alone. I'm here because I want to be with you for reasons that have nothing to do with obligation." She let the silence between them settle like a benediction. "Will you promise," she said finally, "that if this changes, if being together ever compromises your care for patients or makes you act against your ethics, you'll tell me? And if you have to step away, that you will?" He looked at her with a steadiness that felt as solid as a promise. "Yes," he said, "I'll tell you. And if stepping away is what's needed to protect boundaries, I'll do it. But I will not leave you alone because of fear." There was the beat of truth in that, one that would not be traded like currency. It felt like the first time someone had negotiated with her without demanding a discount on her complexity. When he did finally break his rule, he did so without fanfare. It was a quiet, lonely act. He stepped out into the corridor after she had been admitted and, against the small, self-imposed law he'd kept for years, followed her to the bathroom when she said she felt unsteady. He did not touch her in ways that were not consented to. He simply walked her back and stood on the other side of a thin curtain while she washed her face. That might not sound like much, but for Sophie it was a breaking open, a shared moment of proximity, where a professional boundary crossed into a humane one because her safety mattered more than the letter of a rule. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the curtain's weave. "For what?" she said. "For stepping beyond the line I drew," he answered. "I broke my rule." She leaned back against the tiles, feeling the cool shine of hospital light against her eyelids. "You broke it to be human," she said. "And for that, I'm grateful." The confession that followed was the one that mattered most. He spoke of his past betrayal in more detail, of someone who had promised fidelity and then traded it for advantage, the betrayal delivered with a contractual voice that made intimacy transactional. He spoke of the months afterward when he had relied on work as ballast. He admitted that being with her was an experiment in hope that terrified him and gave him something like a new vocabulary. Sophie, in turn, laid out her own vulnerabilities, the small economics of her life, the habit of shrinking, the way honesty had sometimes been punished in earlier relationships that preferred ornamental compliance. They spoke with earnestness and impatience both about what they wanted, a relationship that did not put one person's needs above the others, that gave each the right to be finite and whole. He never used his position to coax consent. Nothing of their intimacy began in a clinic bed. When they first kissed, it was months into a gentle courtship in the back of the bookstore after hours, with the world reduced to the hush of paper and a single lamp. He paused first, as if asking permission for silence, then bent. The kiss was sweet, not urgent, an agreement struck in private. Afterward, they both laughed like people who had made a small voyage and returned. The time that followed was a montage of steady days, them cooking clumsy dinners together, helping each other shelve books, Daniel teaching Sophie how to make an espresso the way he liked it, and her showing him the exact corner of the bookstore where the best light landed for reading in winter. They met each other's friends. He showed her the quiet charity projects he supported, the clinics he had helped fund in neighborhoods that needed them. She met the people who ran the community centers she volunteered at on Sundays. The differences in their lives did not evaporate, but they settled into a pattern where each had agency and voice. When he proposed, it was not an elaborate stage, but an intentionality that felt like everything they'd built. He did not brandish grand gestures. Instead, he organized. A weekend away at a small coastal inn, the same shoreline photograph that had hung in her first exam room, now framed on the bed, and a book waiting on the pillow that contained a letter he had written in his neat handwriting. She found him at dawn on the beach, bare feet in cold sand, his breath visible in the morning air. Sophie, he said, and the world around them was an audience of one. She looked at him, the salt of the sea in her hair and a band of frost on her lashes. He knelt in the sand, not because he had to, but because there was an old romance in the gesture that softened the moment. He held a small ring that caught the pale light. "I broke a rule for you once," he said. "I kept my promise in other ways. I want to keep making promises that weave safety and choice together. Will you marry me?" Tears came unexpectedly, not because the ring glittered, but because the question asked her to accept herself as someone worthy of being asked. "Yes," she said. The sound of the word had the particular authority of a person choosing to step into a life. They married in a small ceremony, no public parade of status, only the people who had been real in their lives. Harper and the bookstore staff, the nurse who had once handed Sophie a referral, close colleagues of Daniel's who had watched his restraint and growth. There were flowers, a cake baked by a friend, a reading from her favorite poet. In a moment that grabbed at the core of how they had been formed, Sophie thought about the card that had once been a relic and now felt like a map. The world had moved from transactional to tender. Years later, when the life they had opted for settled into a steady rhythm, they would tell the story of how boundaries had been their scaffolding and honesty their policy. They would say that the rule he once kept was not a wall, but a frame, that holding to it had saved them from lives that might have ended with hands-on power rather than shared agency. They would remember the night he followed her outside, and how that small transgression had been carefully repaired by a sequence of choices that kept respect and consent at the center. Sophie kept the old white card in a drawer, not as a talisman of fortune, but as a reminder of the line she had crossed and the person who had walked with her without claiming her. Once, when asked what had changed her mind, she laughed and said simply, "He made me believe I could be ordinary and loved." Daniel, who had the habit of answering with fewer words, would add, And she made me learn that careful can become brave when it has someone to be careful for. Their life was not flawless. They navigated miscommunications and the small resentments that bubble up in shared closets. But at the bones of it, there was mutual choice. They chose each other again and again, not because one had power over the other, but because love had been folded into the architecture of their days. They chose to be practical and romantic in equal measure, a plan for finances and the ritual of coffee in bed on lazy Sundays. On an ordinary morning, years after the first clinic visit, Sophie stood in the kitchen, sun finding the dust in the air like a private congregation, and watched Daniel at the counter. He turned and their eyes met, a conversation beginning in the steady clarity of everyday things. She felt small sometimes still, but no longer because the world demanded it. She had learned to unfold in ways that let the light in. If this story has moved you even a little, please consider liking and subscribing for more. Stories like Sophie and Daniel's remind us that respect, patience, and honesty can build durable love, sometimes starting in a small white card and a careful promise.